Hi, everyone. Live demos. What can I say? Okay, so just a little bit of a recap about what I just said. My name is Jaco, in case we haven't met before. I'm the executive who looks after the IMServe division within BBD. IMServe is a specialized unit that focuses on cloud enablement and cloud migrations. We help both internal teams and our clients to leverage the cloud, but also ensure that when they eventually migrate and run in the cloud, that they do so efficiently. We've got three primary services that we offer to our clients and our internal teams. It's advisory services, professional services, and managed services on all things AWS, or what some of you might know as Amazon Web Services. Like I mentioned earlier on, migrating to the cloud, or the concept of cloud, is by no means new. It's something that's been in the market for quite some time, but the conversation around the cloud has accelerated in the last couple of months, especially the last 18 months or so. As I mentioned, I think this acceleration, without a doubt, was pushed by COVID. There's actually, didn't mention it earlier on, but there's this awesome article I read a couple of weeks ago. It actually said that COVID accelerated cloud adoption by 4 years. So I've always been interested to understand, how quickly did it accelerate? And when I read that, I was quite surprised to see the 4-year mark. Anyway, I don't think it was just COVID that forced this acceleration. If you look at what's been happening in the South Africa market specifically, in 2019, we had both Azure and Huawei Cloud open up their local regions. And then further to that, in 2020, AWS opened up their local region. This surely, without a doubt, put a little bit more comfort, gave a lot of our clients a little bit more comfort around where their data will be, but also not having any challenges around latency at all. If you look at prioritization, I genuinely believe that a lot of people were interested in going cloud. It's always been something that people said, I want to do it. But the actual execution of it didn't quite happen as often as I think a lot of people would have wanted it to be. Fast forward a couple of months and all of a sudden we're all confined to our homes and we need to change how we do things, what we're doing, and how are we running our systems. I think what's an interesting fact is that Zoom increased their sales by 370% compared to the previous year. This directly speaks to how people had to change what they were doing at the time in order to cope with the changes that COVID forced them to make. It wasn't just communication, it was how are people running systems, but more importantly, where are they running those systems? No new hardware at the time was being delivered by the likes of IBM, HP, Dell, or whoever the case might be, because our borders were closed. So those providers could not bring in any physical equipment whatsoever. So anyone wanting to launch a new application or launch a new system to maybe combat what was happening from a COVID perspective, or just because they want to innovate, they couldn't. They were forced to make that jump to the cloud. What's even more interesting is that leading up to COVID, there was a Gartner study on cloud adoption, and it found that 90% of enterprises want to go cloud, and they've got a cloud strategy. Yet only 14% of those enterprises actually spend on cloud. And you can only imagine how big a bigger percentage of that 14% spend goes to things like Zoom, Office 365, and other sort of cloud services. So even though a lot of people said, I want to do it, there was a big difference between what they wanted to do and what they were actually executing on. The same study found that the biggest reason for this gap is because of knowledge and capacity. In South Africa, a lot of enterprises and organizations lean on companies like ourselves to sort of fill those knowledge and capacity gaps for them. What is interesting is that a big portion of all of the migrations to the AWS cloud in the last year had a partner involved in some way or another. So in today's conversation, or in today's presentation, I'm going to be focusing a bit on what are those gaps that we help fill, but also what are the 3 primary phases that we should follow to execute on a good migration strategy to the cloud. So let's start with the 4 primary functions that we fill when filling those gaps and some of the knowledge we can help share with our clients. Firstly, there's plan and design. So that's helping understand exactly, well, cool, you want to go to the cloud. How do you do it? What do you need to do? And what should that look like? Secondly, there's the building and migrating. A lot of clients or a lot of organizations might not necessarily have the capability to go and build on this new platform that they've never touched before. Thirdly, it's running and operating. Everyone always believes that going to the cloud it's easy, and it is. But I truly believe that it's not migrating to the cloud doesn't change what you do. It's just how you do what you do. And it's that how that's important. So during this process, we also share with our clients, well, how do you do it? And how do you do it effectively to ensure that you're that you're operating effectively, but also that you're secure at all times. And then lastly, it's optimize, which I think is a key thing. And when talking about optimization, that's not just ensuring that everything is running effectively. It's also looking at, well, how can we do things a little bit better? Taking those monolith applications and modernizing them, perhaps. But we also need to always remember that when it comes to cloud migrations, it isn't just about what you're doing from a technical perspective and how you need to change things technically. There's also a very big organizational change that our clients would need to go through. They need to not just change where they're running their systems and so on, but it's also how do they manage security in the cloud? How do they change things from an operational perspective? Even something like billing. It's a big change that they'll be going through. So we need to be able to guide them through this process and help them understand, well, this is the change your organization's going through. Here's how you address each and every one of those changes. What's quite cool is we got access to an AWS program about 2 months or so ago. It's called the Migration Acceleration Program. It's a migration framework AWS put together. It's everything that map is built around can ultimately be applied to any cloud out there. So even if you're migrating to Azure, GCP, Huawei Cloud, or even Alibaba Cloud, let's avoid Alibaba perhaps. I don't know, but anyway, so you can pretty much use it on any one of those, but you just need to be mindful that what could be applicable and what might not be so applicable. Anyway, so MAP is built around 3 distinct phases. Firstly, there's what's called the assess phase. Assess is very much focused on getting a good understanding of what your client or what the organization's estate looks like today. Not just from a technical perspective, but what kind of knowledge do they have? What kind of capabilities do they have? And what gaps might actually prohibit you from being able to migrate or leverage the cloud for your project? Secondly, there's what's called the mobilize phase. It's about getting the foundations in place. Anything that we potentially picked up during the first phase, when going through and asking the necessary questions and identifying gaps, through the mobilize phase, we go and fill those gaps. And then lastly, migrate. This is where we go and we physically operate on AWS, where we productionize whatever workloads we've migrated, but then ensure in the long run that they're running effectively. The MAP framework is intended to accelerate cloud adoption. So to help ensure that, like I said, any gaps that might, or any challenges that could prohibit you from leveraging the cloud, to fill those gaps and ensure cloud adoption is done effectively. The framework's built on the back of, I think it's something like 1,000 different AWS migrations that AWS were involved in directly. So everything I might mention could be applicable to a migration that you might be busy with and might be to another cloud, but not all of it might be applicable. So listen through, hear what I've got to say, and see how you can use any one of these tools or mechanisms to help make your journey that you're busy going through perhaps now just a little bit easier. Anyway, so let's get into it. Firstly, like I said, there's the assess phase. The assess phase is focused on getting a good grip of what's currently happening in a client's environment, what applications they might have that they're looking to migrate, and ultimately just getting a good understanding of, is a migration possible or not? The very first task within the assess phase is what's called a migration readiness assessment. That's quite a mouthful. So I'm going to stick to MRA for now. So a migration readiness assessment is a bit of a workshop kind of style engagement with a client. have a session for about 3 or 4 hours, and we run through about 78 different questions that all touch on different aspects of the business, be it to understand what their security goals are, what they want to achieve from a business perspective, technical perspective, but also getting a grip of what capabilities, knowledge, and skills they currently have in the organization that can help during this journey. Next up in the process is what's called the discovery phase. Discovery is all about understanding what servers are running, what applications they're currently running, what kind of storage is being used, but all in all, how is each and every one of these things being utilized today? It's intended to give you a good understanding of what the technical estate looks like in order to go and do what's called a TCO. But I'll get into the TCO process just a little bit later. For now, I just want to focus a bit on how do we make this discovery process just a bit easier. Currently, AWS provide us with various tools that we can run within a client's environment that they can, or that'll give us good insights into how that environment's being leveraged and ultimately what would it need to look like when going to AWS. There's all in all 6 tools available, all free to us. But there's one I want to just quickly talk about, which I think is worth always investigating when doing a migration plan. It's called a migration evaluator. It used to be called TSO Logic. AWS bought TSO Logic about 2 years ago and just made the tool free to anyone who wants to use it and to help them plan for their migration. It's a little agent that you install within your environment. It'll go and scan all of your servers, how they're being utilized, what resources do you currently have allocated, and all of those nice things. And ultimately come back with, if you want to migrate this whole estate, this is what it would look like in AWS, the kind of resources you would need, the kind of networking you would need. And ultimately, the key thing is giving you good insights into, well, is it possible or not? Is it feasible or not? But that does also lead into into the next step, which is TCO. TCO is total cost of ownership. So it's getting a good understanding of, well, if I migrate this to the cloud, what is it going to cost me? So there's 2 key things to take into account here. From a current perspective, there's what is my servers costing me? What is it costing me to maintain this environment? You need to think about power, electricity, all of those things. But then when it comes to migrating, you don't just need to think about, well, what are the actual resources inside of AWS going to cost me? There's the operational costs again, it's the migration cost. So there's a lot of different things that make up this TCO process. But the intention of doing TCO is to get a good understanding of, is it viable from a financial perspective or not? Because the cloud does bring a lot of benefits, but you need to always be mindful that it doesn't always mean it's going to be cheaper, but it could provide you with enough benefits to justify that additional spend. But if we look at all of these tools that I was referring to just now, a lot of them have a big focus on lift and shift. So taking what I have running on site right now and migrating it to the cloud as is. But I think we all know that that's by no means the BBD way. We love to modernize the legacy applications, take those monoliths and decouple them, make them a little bit more future ready. And that's the key thing that we need to take into account when looking at this TCO process. It isn't just as simple as, well, take the lift and shift and there's your price. We need to think about what are we going to be doing with each and every application as we go through this migration journey. One of the things that's quite often overlooked when doing a TCO analysis is licensing. Licensing can so easily cause a migration journey to be a little bit more expensive or sometimes a little bit more cost effective than what you initially thought. Licensing can be a bit of a challenge. So I just want to use an example quickly of like Microsoft SQL. Microsoft SQL is probably running in majority of our clients' environments. And if you don't have what's called active software assurance on your license, you can't just simply take it as is and migrate it to the cloud, well, to AWS, to what's called EC2. And this is actually the case with most clouds. That's, in my opinion, Microsoft's way of ring fencing a little bit. Anyway, so get into that. So software, if you have software assurance, you can migrate it. If you don't, there's 3 strategies that you can follow to actually still leverage a database or migrate your database to the cloud. Firstly, there's what's called dedicated hosts inside of AWS. Dedicated hosts are slightly more expensive than just a simple EC2. And if you're not migrating enough workloads to the cloud, it might not be justifiable from a costing perspective. Secondly, you could relicense inside of AWS, meaning leverage one of their SQL licenses. But now you need to take into account that that license that's currently purchased and that we currently own, it's going to go to waste. Unless obviously there's an application on site that you could use it for. Lastly, there's modernize that application. Change it from SQL to something open source. Maybe MySQL, Postgres, or whatever the case might be. But if we look at all three of these options, the first two would ultimately give you, or would result in a little bit of an increase in cost, because now you'd need to pay for additional things which you might not have planned for. And then thirdly, modernize, that will definitely decrease your costs. So if you look at what your licensing would be on an annual basis and perhaps even your operational costs, but there's modernization involved. So now there's additional costs around that. So all of these things always have to be evaluated while going through the TCO process. But now what's cool is that AWS launched another service to help address that challenge a little bit. It's a service called Babelfish, launched earlier this year. See it as a translation tool. It's intended to take your SQL queries and just translate it to Postgres queries, which means you don't need to actually go and modernize your application or change your application in order to leverage Postgres. But I don't know. I'm not a DBA. I'm pretty sure the sales collateral makes it sound just a little bit easier than what it actually is. But I think the point of this whole thing is you need to get a good understanding of each and every application currently running in the environment and having a plan for what you're going to be doing with each. So there's what's called the 6 R's. It's different migration strategies that can be applied pretty much to any application that you're looking to migrate. And you'll pretty much find that each and every one of these might have a little home for all of your applications that you're currently evaluating. Firstly, there's what's called rehosting. I referred to it earlier on. It's lift and shift. It's taking what you have running on site today and migrating it to the cloud as is. You'll obviously benefit from stuff like additional uptime, perhaps a little bit more scalability and so on. But I'm not a big fan of lift and shift because I find that it's often more expensive than pretty much just running it on site. But again, if you've been having issues from an uptime perspective or whatever the case might have been on site, there could be enough benefit to migrate as a lift and shift. The next option is replatforming. Some people refer to it as lift, tinker, and shift. It means take what you have, change it a little bit, and then migrate. What this would often look like is taking your SQL database or whatever database you might have had and migrating it to a managed service on AWS, like RDS as an example. So RDS stands for Relational Database Service. It's a managed service from AWS that helps you decrease your operational costs and so on. So the key thing around this strategy is making a couple of changes, but not really changing the core of your application. The third option is repurchase. See this pretty much as moving to a different product. I think a lot of clients or a lot of organizations in the last couple of years went through this process. If you look at the big transition to Office 365 as an example, a lot of organizations would have had mail servers that someone had to look after the equipment, had to maintain and manage and all of those great things. And there was this big shift to Office 365, and that's the repurchase. You need to think about, is this application, or is there really a reason to migrate this application, or is there perhaps an easier way to do it? The next option is re-architect. I think this is one of the things that, like I said earlier on, we as BBD love to do. A lot of people would refer to re-architecting as modernizing. Re-architecting is where you take your application and you change it completely. Being able to leverage some of the cloud native services or decoupling it so that you can more effectively manage it in the long run. Re-architecting is most often the most expensive of these different kind of migration strategies, but it is the most rewarding in a sense of operational costs being able to drop your operational costs and making maintenance and management perhaps just a little bit easier in the long run. The next option, or the next migration strategy, is retire. There was a study that found that between 10 to 20% of an enterprise's IT environment or just servers running can just simply be turned off because it's not being used. And that leads me to the point of, when looking at migrating to the cloud, only migrate what makes sense. It shouldn't ever be a case of just doing it because we want to do it. It should make sense, not just from a technical perspective, but from a business perspective. The last option is retaining. This pretty much just means leave it where it is today and perhaps get back to it a little bit later. I think retaining is more applicable when the client or an organization might have gone through a process to where they just upgraded their equipment and they might be sweating that tin just a little bit. And at a later stage, you could always revisit this particular application. Anyway, that was all of the migration strategies. So once we've gone through that process, the next thing that I find to be very important when generally engaging with an organization or when looking at a migration is workshops. There's a lot of confusion and a lot of just unknowns for a lot of organizations around the cloud. This is a good way or a good mechanism to demystify it. So having those necessary engagements with an organization to say, well, no, you won't just be exposing all of your data and whatever other concerns they might have. Anyway, so at the end of the assess phase, which we are right now, we provide the client with a business plan. The intention here of a business plan isn't just to say, yes, it makes sense, or no, it doesn't make sense, but to provide them with all of the information that we found right throughout this process. Does it make sense? What are the technical changes that would need to be made? What do you need to do from a skills perspective and just from a team perspective? So everything that we found right throughout this process, we address in a business plan. Anyway, so as we got to the end of the assess phase, we presented a business plan and we got that thumbs up. Cool. We want to go down this cloud journey. It's what everyone's doing. It sounds fun. Like I mentioned earlier on, this process, the mobilize phase, is all about getting all of the fundamentals in place, getting the foundations in place. And the key place to start is security. Tony mentioned it earlier on in the keynote as well. I think security is becoming everyone's problem, not just the security officer or whatever. It's becoming everyone's. Everyone needs to think about security. It needs to be top of mind. And when looking at a cloud migration, that should be the first thing that you try and engage on and get a good understanding of. It'll help you understand how you can architect your environment in a sense of understanding what services you can use or can't use, what the regions you can run in, what regions you potentially can't run in. But also, it will put you in a position to architect an environment perhaps in just a little bit of an easier way to actually address the client or an organization's security requirements. Anyway, next up, part of the security conversation is compliance, which I think is a key thing. And if you look at what everyone just had to go through from a POPI perspective, compliance is top of mind for a lot of organizations. AWS currently have 26 compliance frameworks that they comply to across the board on their infrastructure, which means if you run an application in AWS, you inherit those compliance structures. But there's still a big thing around shared responsibility, meaning just because you're running it in AWS doesn't mean all of a sudden you comply to GDPR or PCI or whatever the case might be. You still have some work to do. And therefore, you need to still plan and architect your environment in such a way that you comply against these frameworks that the client is ultimately working towards. Anyway, once we've addressed all of that and we've got a good understanding of security and compliance, we get into what's called the landing zone. Landing zones is pretty much where you go and you build a security framework that you want to try and comply against when actually migrating to the cloud. It also includes what you're doing from a networking perspective, But I think what's quite cool, AWS launched a service called Control Tower, I think about 2 years ago or so, that makes that process a little bit easier. It's a central place where you can go and you can create guardrails to say what can people do and what can't they do in AWS accounts. This is a good way to ensure that if there is specific security goals or compliance goals that an organization might be working towards, this makes that process just a little bit easier. Anyway, next up is what's called getting a cloud center of excellence in place. It's ultimately just having a team or a person inside of the organization who thinks cloud first or has a good understanding of what this cloud journey looks like and what they're ultimately working towards. Having someone like that who can walk this journey with us just makes it a little bit easier to help us understand what can they do, what can't they do, and I think there's a big enablement thing that addresses as well. Anyway, so cool. We've, through the previous phase and through what we've just done, gotten a good understanding of what the current environment looks like, what applications are being used, and all of those nice things. Now it's about putting a plan together. How are we actually going to get to the cloud? I always recommend starting with the easy stuff, especially if this is the very first migration that you'll be going through. Start with simple stuff like storage, non-critical or non-business critical applications. It'll help build some confidence within the team around how to use the cloud and introduce some of the core concepts as well. Anyway, throughout the building phase, we did a lot of planning. Now, finally, the mobilize phase, we did a lot of planning. Now we finally get to do some building. So through the previous steps that we took, we identified what the networking requirements might be, security, and all of those nice things. This is now where we finally go and put some foundational infrastructure in place to ensure that we set this whole environment up for success from a networking and security perspective. Okay, cool. Finally, we get to migrate. Like I mentioned earlier on, the migrate phase is all about operating on the cloud. It's ensuring that you do it effectively, but also ensuring that all applications being migrated are running as optimized and as optimally as what they potentially could. So once we get to the migration time, I want to encourage everyone that once you start actually moving applications over, we probably would have used a couple of tools in the earlier phases, and it would have said, you're currently using X amount of CPU, so much RAM, and whatever the case might have been. In AWS, you should use this. And that's cool. But still, keep on looking at all of the resources. How are they being utilized, and are they running as efficiently as what it potentially should? This is a great time to ensure that if you need to make any changes to the resources that you've allocated, do it now. There's 4 key things that I always think you should look at monitoring within your environment. Firstly, it's security. Secondly, utilization. Third, governance. And then fourth, cost. All of these things are important. And if they aren't looked at effectively in the long run, I think you might have some challenges coming your way. So if you can set up alerting, if you can set up any automation that can help you overcome any challenges with any one of these 4 things. Within MServe, to give you an example, we use a tool called Systems Manager. It's an AWS tool that makes patching and backups of servers, databases, all of those things just a little bit easier, so that we don't have to, on a daily or a weekly basis, have to constantly go into a server, do the patching. It's all automated. And try wherever you can to automate whatever you can. Anyway, so cool. We've migrated. We've ensured it's running as optimally as what we potentially could. Now we look at what's called reserved instances or savings plans. Reserved instances have been around for quite some time. Reserved instances and savings plans, in the core of them, pretty much the same thing. You make a commitment for X amount of spend or X or whatever resources that you will be utilizing for the next year or potentially 3 years, and AWS give you a discount. there's about a 72% discount that you can get on your consumption. So it's important to review these kinds of things because at the end of the day, this is how you decrease that total cost of ownership that I was talking about earlier on. Anyway, so now we get to modernization. This is the last part of the actual migration journey. The key thing around modernization is, as we went through the process, we would have taken a couple of applications perhaps as is, where we did those lift and shifts and they're running in the cloud and they're benefiting, like I said, scalability and a bunch of other awesome things. But it's also worth always investigating, does it not make sense to modernize these to a decoupled kind of application, or potentially leveraging microservices or serverless or whatever the buzzword tomorrow might be. But I think the key thing here is see how can we make things better on an ongoing basis. When it comes to modernization, there's also two key phases that we go through. Firstly, there's the assess phase. Very similar to what we did earlier on, but this is mostly focused on how is an application being used and how would it look if we were to decouple it and modernize this application. Then secondly, there's the action phase, where we go and whatever we just learned through the success phase, we actually go and apply. More and more organizations are making the change to modernize and to go open source, not just because they find that licensing costs are increasing on a year-by-year basis, but it's allowing them to be a little bit more agile and give them a little bit more flexibility, perhaps. Anyway, so we're at the end of our migration journey. It's time for us to dot our I's and cross our T's, ensure everything is running as effectively as it can, everything is modernized, and wherever possible, let's try and save our clients, or let's save as much money as what we can. So just a little bit of a recap. So when doing a migration journey, 3 key phases that we should always look at addressing. Firstly, there's the assess phase, focused about getting the foundations in place. Assess phase, getting a good understanding of the client's current or an organization's current environment. Mobilize phase is about getting the foundations in place. Like I mentioned, security is key here. So let's ensure we always that we always think about security first. And then thirdly, there's migrating. So ensuring that the environment's running effectively and is always optimized and potentially modernized. Anyway, that's me for the second time. Let me know if you might be going through any migration and you need some assistance, or if you want to know about any of those tools that I mentioned earlier on. Thank you very much.